I was doing news at the time for the radio station, and eventually the people at Wink heard about me through previous employees who had worked for them in Charlotte County, and they said, you got to get this guy McLaughlin because he knows Charlotte County. So Wink asked me twice to come to work for them, and I said no.
And how long were you with the station at that
A
point?
year.
A year, okay. So
And
that was
then-
really quick.
Yeah, it was. And then finally, the third time they asked, I said yes. And I have to backtrack a little bit, because back in '75, during that 6-month period from November to roughly April of '76, when I was trying to get a job, one of the places I went was Wink. And I just showed up. I had no protocol, I had no idea of what to do about getting a job in TV. And they sent a young lady out from the newsroom who had nothing to do with management. She had no authority for anything. They just said, go talk to this guy, just say thank you and he'll go away. Well, they sent this young lady out, and she looked at my resume, and we were sitting next to each other just like this in the lobby. And she looked at it and she laughed. And she said, well, Mr. McLaughlin, y'all don't have any experience in television. Now how could we possibly hire you? And she laughed again. And I said, thank you. And I left. And that stuck with me. Wink hired me. And the day I was supposed to start work at Wink was the day after Memorial Day, 1977. The day before that, I was in a boating accident. A friend in Charlotte County had taken me out with his son for a celebratory fishing expedition. The boat broke, I got thrown out, I wound up in the hospital for 2 weeks, and Wink held the job for me.
Wow.
And I showed up Labor Day weekend, 1977, and one of the first people that greeted me in the newsroom was the girl who had interviewed me, sitting in the chair in the lobby. She didn't remember me.
Did you tell her the story?
Oh, of course I did. And she turned out to be very sweet. We became good friends, and she and her husband moved away. But it was just one of those little ironies that, you never know how things are going to turn out. And it turned out very well for me. And here I am. That's the short version. It was phenomenal. To anyone who was not here in the 70s and the early 80s, it's probably kind of hard to imagine US 41 only being 4-lane, 2-lane in most parts south. The last real bona fide business in South Fort Myers was near what is now Daniels Parkway. Daniels Parkway really didn't exist. Metro didn't exist. Summerlin didn't exist. I-75 didn't exist. It was hard to get anywhere. To get to the beach, you had to go McGregor. Their Gladiolus was a killer road. It had a huge curve in it that just people would get killed almost every weekend. The road through Estero and Bonita Springs was the boondocks. Nobody wanted to live there. Why would you 4-lane it? Why would you 6-lane it? And now look at it, it just exploded. There was no bell tower. The Edison Mall was the only place to shop. It was just phenomenal to see how things progressed. And very early on, I recognized that this, they call it the ADI, the Area of Dominant Influence. It's a ratings acronym that they use to determine the ratings area. So for us, it was the metropolitan Fort Myers Cape Coral area. And we were, as a market, we were jumping 10 marketplaces a year.
Wow.
We were the fastest growing television market in the country. It had nothing to do with the TV stations, it had to do with the population. The population was doubling every 10 years. And all of a sudden, well, we got to build more roads, we got to build more bridges, we've got to build this, we have to build that. And golf course communities started cropping up, and it became a real phenomenon. Every day there was a growth story. And very early on, I recognized that, especially once I became the main anchorman in 1980, that I was a fairly decent-sized frog in a pond that was growing exponentially. And eventually, I became a bigger frog in a huge pond. And I don't think any of us really imagined what was going to happen in the early 80s. I don't think, clearly from a planning perspective, the planners didn't realize what was going to happen based on the fact that it took decades to get the roads up to what we needed and bridges and all of that.
Even now with all the construction that's going on,
It's
trying
incredible.
to keep up with.
I mean, you look out the window here and it's hard to remember what this looked like. I did a decade in review special in 1979, and I remember doing a stand-up on the roof of the what I guess was the First Federal Savings and Loan, which was kind of kitty corner to here. I don't remember. It's across from City Hall. And as I looked out here today with you, almost none of it was here. The high rises weren't here. This hotel wasn't here. No parking garage. No harbor side. It was just a different downtown Fort Myers. It was old Fort Myers, and they kept trying to reinvent it. They would change First Street to one way. They would change it to a snake design. They would put diagonal parking, and it seemed like every 2 years they tried to change downtown
I think they
Fort
just
Myers.
do that to drive people crazy.
Well, they're
personally
still
do.
trying to do it, and the sad thing is that it's one of the neatest parts of Southwest Florida. Downtown Fort Myers is awesome, but because it's such a 9-to-5 community, people have that mindset, and if you can get people to stay until 6 or 7, you're lucky, and then they're gone. And it's difficult to maintain a mom and pop business down here these days.
Oh, absolutely. Now, how did you, were you finding that you were being recognized everywhere you went since you were on TV now? And did you have that Brad Pitt paparazzi following you and a following of ladies, or?
No, it was never anything like that. The recognition factor was hard to deal with because all my life I'd been a nobody, and nobody ever paid any attention to me. I never felt like I contributed anything. It's that geek factor that I lived with all my life. And when I started, it started a little bit when I was in radio in Punta Gorda. People would recognize my voice because they never saw me.
You have very distinct,
Like,
broadcasting.
And that still happens today. I'll be dressed in grubs, standing in line at the checkout counter, and if people hear me talking to the clerk, they'll go, "Aren't you that guy on TV that does the weather?" And I say, yes and no. But that took some getting used to. And until 1979, when you combine the alcoholism with the notoriety and the recognition and the fact that I was making money, I wasn't out of control, but there was the potential for that. I was probably this close to being out of control. And because you don't have all day, I'll make a long story short, in February 1979, I decided that I was too close to the edge and I needed to stop drinking, so I did, cold turkey. And a year later, I became the 6 and 11 o'clock anchorman. And at that point, I realized that my life had changed forever. I was living in a fishbowl, and fortunately my drinking days were behind me. It's a battle I still fight every single day, but because of what I did for so many years, it labeled me, it made me aware of my public persona, and that I have no privacy. And it's difficult to explain to people. It's not a paparazzi kind of thing, but it's the realization that when I walk into a room or a restaurant, and all of us have this, it's not just me, and this is not my ego talking, the reality is that when I walk into a room or a restaurant or a store or whatever, there's a